Nice. So let's get cracking. Thank you so much for joining and taking your time to participate in this webinar. This is going to be on debugging in Retool, talking through AI-powered troubleshooting for your apps and workflows. As an introduction from me, I'm Ollie Clyde. I'm a support engineer here at Retool. I have a background in software development and tech consulting, and unsurprisingly, in my day-to-day work with customers, I do loads of debugging, helping solve lots of their more technical challenges and problems across Retool. So let's start with a brief agenda of what we're going to use this hour session for. I'm first going to give a little introduction around, what is debugging, why is it important, etc., etc. Why are we here? And then we're going to spend the bulk of the session going through the scenario that we're going to use, and then spending around 40 minutes talking through the scenario, and we'll give more details around instructions and how you can take part or just watch along for this example. And then finally, at the end, we'll run a little recap, talking through what were the main points I was trying to get across, as well as hopefully some time, depending on how fast we go, for some questions and answers at the end. Again, yeah, feel free to kind of chuck any questions as we go in the chat. But with that said, let's get started. So, the art of debugging. Sometimes it feels like an art, sometimes like a science. I first of all wanted to start with kind of why is it important? Why are we here? Why is it worth discussing? And I think essentially software development is just as much about debugging as it is about building, and it's kind of such a crucial skill. And although Retool, as maybe you already know, it makes it far easier to build software and reduces that barrier to entry, it still requires some of those fundamental software development skills and debugging skills. And as quoted by Brian Kernighan, who is a famous computer scientist, he says that debugging is twice as hard as writing the code in the first place. I imagine maybe there's been times in your life, there's been very few in mine, but I've written a piece of code or built some piece of software and it's worked first time, and I think I'm a incredible genius. But 99.9% of the times I get something wrong, or I haven't thought of an edge case, or whatever it may be, and I need to iterate and improve what I've already built. And so it's really kind of a part and parcel of building things, is debugging. Following that, I think it's also worth framing this in the importance of defining the problem before the solution. Although we'll mainly talk around specific techniques within Retool and some kind of common errors that I come across, it is a real common pitfall to get hung up on solving a specific problem rather than understanding the broader picture. And a quote that I like to keep in mind, particularly when working with customers, is if I had 1 hour to save the world, I'd spend 55 minutes defining the problem and only 5 minutes finding the solution, from Albert Einstein. I think it's a really nice way to ensure that we're not getting stuck in the weeds and obsessed around a technical solution, but actually understanding kind of what are we solving for. I also thought it's worth kind of framing this in the context of AI, and kind of both where Retool's going with this, but also the wider industry. And I think, has this changed this? Is debugging as important? And I think on that first point, I think you could argue that it's now less about understanding specific technical concepts or techniques, and more about working through problems logically. And so, if anything, obviously I'd be biased from from my position and role, but I would argue that debugging, if anything, is more important than it kind of ever used to be. So you're more likely to encounter code bases or software or retool apps where maybe you don't actually understand how it was built, or who wrote the code, or why it was written in that way. And actually, so you're more likely to need to quite quickly understand the problem you're trying to solve, the context around it, etc., etc. And so, if anything, some of those core skills around logical thinking and problem solving, I think, are just as important, if not more so now, with AI taking away maybe some of the technical knowledge you may need. And then finally, I think an easier point to make on the second around defining the problem. I think it's probably going to be easier than ever to create solutions and build software. As I mentioned before, the barrier to entry and software development is lowering, and that's particularly, as we'll talk about, with Assist, which is Retool's solution to use natural language to build applications. There's a greater chance that you're going to build solutions that potentially don't solve real problems. And so I think, again, that makes this quote an area even more important to think about. And so we'll touch on this again kind of throughout this webinar, but I think it's an important thing to kind of anchor as we go through this scenario. And so moving on to that, the scenario for today is going to be about our colleague Jerry, who has built an MVP for a software access request portal to help demo whether Retool can be used to manage our company's various software providers. But he's left for holiday in Hawaii before finishing it, leaving us to pick up the pieces. I think it's fair to say we're not a fan of Jerry anymore. He's really left us in the lurch here. But unsurprisingly, it's given us some good sections to run through around debugging and Retool. So we're going to have these 5 main sections that we're going to touch on. We're going to start with app context and the debugging tools. Then we're going to go into root cause analysis, so trying to understand the source of bugs and issues within Retool. We're then going to get into resource query debugging, JavaScript debugging, and finish on workflow debugging. To set some context around kind of knowledge for this, if you've never touched Retool, that's perfect. We'll go really slowly and you can pick up lots of the basic things around debugging within Retool. If you have used Retool before and you're still looking to try and find some new techniques or new areas you come across, I do hope that I will also provide some additional tools or things you haven't learned before. So hopefully we can cover kind of both scenarios there. So onto some logistics. You should have received an invite email from our webinar instance. It's EMEA. What is it called? It is called EMEAagents.retool.com. And using that invite email, you should be able to log in and create an account. If you've joined us before, also I could see some had logged in earlier, you may need to kind of log in again, and that should then take you to this instance. And this is, if you want to follow along manually, practically with us, you can set up a copy of an app to then run through the scenario with me, or if you're not so interested, you can just watch along and watch me do it. As also it's posted in the chat by Amar, we should also have some instructions for you to run through as well. If you kind of get lost or want to catch up with where we are, but also have a written summary of kind of what we discussed today. So the main thing to set your own app up is to ensure that you copy the main app. So it should be, once you log in, you should be taken to recents. Hopefully you should see it there, but if not, you may need to move to published and search for it. And you can search for debugging or main. And in doing so, you should then be able to, at this ellipses at the side of the app, you should then be able to create a duplicate. You'd want to include your email within the duplicate just to ensure that there's no copies. If you use the same name as someone else, it will cause an error. And you want to, hopefully when you create it, you should be able to set it by default, it will set it within your own drafts. So for example, here, if I do ollyclyde@retool.com, I'm going to create the app. And it should be within my drafts here. And so then within those drafts folder again at the top, you can then click onto the app to then start this webinar scenario with me. I'm going to give a little pause there, as I imagine there may be some questions or you're still logging in, etc., etc. And maybe I can give another run through if needed. Nice. So hopefully you're sat there with your drafts tab open and a nice copy of the main app. And then you can then click through onto the app, which will then initially take you to the preview. I'm also taking the fact that Amar hasn't shouted at me that there aren't any kind of core questions or problems so far. So I'm going to take that as a sign to get stuck into the scenario. So the preview of the app. Let's just take a moment to have a little view of what we think is going on here. So I can see we have, unsurprisingly, this software access request portal. At the top, there seems to be some KPIs around total requests, pending approvals, and approved requests. Then seems to have a main table, which I assume is just my software access requests, that now seems to be empty. And at the bottom, there seems to be a table for admins to approve any access requests. It seems to be at the top. I can refresh, but we seem to be getting an error. And if I go to open a request, okay, I can't seem to select any software. And so clearly there's lots of issues here. So chances are this is kind of some type of portal where end users can come on, potentially request software, and admins can then either kind of reject or approve that. So now let's go into the bulk of the webinar, which is going to be editing and seeing what's going under the hood. So at the top right, you should have the option to click Edit App. And in doing so, that will then open up the app into this visual editor. And this is where we can now look under the hood of what is going on here. So where do we start? Where's a good place to get going here? And with this newer feature in Assist, which can be found at the left sidebar at the bottom, there should be a little icon that you can click onto with Assist. This is a great place to start to ask, what does this app do and how is it structured? So with Assist at the bottom, we can select different modes, whether we want to build, create and edit, or just to ask. So for now, let's just ask, how does this app work and what does it do? And hopefully that should give us a nice rundown of what's going on here. But also, while this is loading, I'm also going to point to some core areas that I would always go to when first coming across a new app. On the sidebar, we have a load of useful tools that you're going to come across or when building in Retool use frequently. The first one at the top is pages. So this gives a nice overview of if it's a multi-page app, what are the page structure here? At the moment, it's just one page, so it's nice and simple. We also have the component tree. So this gives a nice breakdown of how the component's structured. Are there any hidden components? How do they fit together? Not so important for today's webinar, but something to keep in mind and be aware of. And then importantly, the main section you should have is the code area. So this should give a breakdown of quite simply all of the logic that your app is functioning on. So such things such, all of your queries, some variables, some transformers, etc., etc. We're going to go into this area in a lot more detail and some of the kind of core bits of this app within it. Hopefully, if we go back to Assist, we should now have a nice overview of what's going on here. So it seemed to have a clear purpose. So the app allows employees to request access to different software applications and enables administrators to review and approve and reject those. So pretty much exactly what we thought when we first had a little overview. There seems to have that request button at the top right where they can have a modal to then submit a request. We are using a Retool database to be able to store those requests. We have some metrics at the top. We have the requests table, etc., etc. And then the approval modal at the bottom. So when an admin clicks to review requests, they can approve it and reject it. Now, some technical architecture, which is a really useful bit of information to understand kind of what some of the logic that's going on here. So we seem to have a Retool database with a mock access requests table, as well as a Postman mock server. And so they seem to be giving our main sources of data for this application, as well as a whole selection of different queries that's pulling or inserting data, as well as some transformers that we're going to get into in more detail. Brilliant. So that's now given us a nice overview of what's going on here. I'm going to close that for now. And now the other area I want to mention is the debugging tools. So at the bottom right here, you should have the option to be able to open up the debug tools. And if you haven't come across these before, unsurprisingly, we're going to use these very heavily during this session. And I'm going to give a little just overview of how they're structured and how you can use them. So, pardon me. So it may look familiar to some of you because they mirror the dev tools or similar debugging tools on your browser. Just for those that are curious, I always think it's kind of quite interesting to see. If you double click on the page kind of outside of the Retool visual editor, you can see your own browser's dev tools. And unsurprisingly here, you can see both this kind of structure of this page, lots of the code, as well as also the console as well, and network requests, etc., etc. And so we've created our own Retool specific debugging tools that can give you lots of information around what's going on in your Retool runtime. And so the first page is the console. So this will give you an overview of all of the successful queries, any errors, and also any info messages. So for now, we're going to filter it so we just see the errors and we just see the info messages. And this is the main intel that we can use to start debugging. The other area I wanted to highlight is the timeline. So this gives a visual representation of the query execution order. So typically all of the queries that are fetching or updating data. And you can see information around timing of these, etc., etc. We're not going to go into much detail on this now. This is mostly useful but for performance issues and the like. And the other area is state. So this gives you a view of all of the current components, queries, variables, etc., etc., that are available within Retool. What is state? State is effectively the snapshot at this given moment in time of all of the information within Retool. We're going to come into more detail around why is state important, how does it work, and how you can use it to debug a little later on. So it's good to be able to flag this now. Brilliant. So I'm going to go back to the console and have that nice kind of open on the page here. And now that we've understood what's going on here with the context of the application, as well as had a little mooch around on the console logs, we're now going to get into the first kind of main section, which is how do you find the root cause of bugs? You've come across an application and there's a load of errors showing, oh no, where do I start with all of this? And so we're going to talk through kind of two main ways to go about this. And effectively, a great place to start, unsurprisingly, is just to pick one of these and use this to work your way backwards to find the root cause of the issue. Lots of times, errors like this are showing as symptoms of a issue further upstream, and so we're gonna work through a scenario together. So to be able to open up and investigate this error in more detail, you should be able to click on these on the side here to open up the associated query with this error. The one that I want to open up is the one that is named all requests with software names. You can see that on the right here. For me, it may be different for you. It's the fourth one down. And if I click onto that, that should then open up this transformer for me. And so then I can use both the error in conjunction here and also the transformer open to now start debugging and finding the root cause here. So for those that aren't aware, transformers, what are they? Effectively, they're ways that they're code within Retool that you can use to write larger reusable blocks of JavaScript. And unsurprisingly, it's typically used to transform data. So whether you're combining data sets, filtering, or kind of whatever it may be. And so if we have a quick run through together of what we think is going on here, at the top, we seem to be pulling in lots of kind of all of the access requests. Then we seem to be also getting the software providers. And then we seem to have a function that is simply combining the two. So we've got all of the requests, and we're going to find for each request, find the associated piece of software, and then we're going to match on that. And then we're going to try and find the name of the software, and then we're returning that so that they're kind of combined together. So with that in mind, let's get started into kind of analyzing this error in more detail. So as I mentioned before, a great place to start is actually on the error itself, unsurprisingly. One thing to note, something that I do all the time is I skim read an error and then I think, oh, I know what's causing this. This is simple. What am I, obvious. Don't take the time to actually properly read it and analyze it. And then, I'm down a rabbit hole when actually if I'd taken the time initially, I could have saved myself lots of effort. So let's take a moment to read through this error. We've got one error, software.find is not a function. And by clicking onto the error, typically in JavaScript, you'll always find a bit more information around which line it's on. And so we can see here, it's highlighting line 5. So if we go to line 5 in the transformer, we can see that software.find function. Now, software.find is not a function, typically means that the .find, the property of .find on software doesn't exist. And so in a slightly obscure JavaScript way, simply that this is saying software is most likely undefined or kind of not appropriate an array to be able to call .find on. So let's now work our way backwards from this using the first method that is a really powerful tool within a Retool, which is being able to hover over any variable within a piece of JavaScript within Retool to understand its current state. So if we're to hover over software here, we can quickly analyze, okay, well, it is software undefined, is it an error? And in quickly doing so here, I can analyze the data and I can see, yeah, there's a clear error going on here and an error message, bad request, etc., etc. So that is undoubtedly must be causing this software.find error in the console. And if we take a moment to work our way back from there, we can see software is defined at the top. And then it's actually defined from this query get software providers. As you may know in Retool, a kind of real trademark Retool thing, double curly braces allows you to access any of these components, queries, state within Retool, and kind of access and then use that data. And so we can see here again hovering over it, it's coming from this get software providers query. And so if we were to hover over the select icon at the top, we can then open up the culprit here. So that's one method, which is using basically the inbuilt function to hover over a variable and view the state instantly. It's really powerful, really easy way to quickly understand what's going on within a transformer. But the other method that I wanted to also talk through is how you can use state and understand state to debug more complex issues. So if I now go back to opening the transformer and I now open up the state tab, I'm going to give a little overview, story time of why state is important and how you can use it to debug within Retool. So for more complex issues, typically where maybe unlike here where we've got a clear error where maybe data isn't showing where you think it should be, or a component is not getting the correct column or whatever, it can be a lot harder to actually understand, particularly more complex applications, where the data is coming from and what links into what. And so this state tab is a great place to be. And so why is it important and kind of why is it a concept that we need to understand? And so to give a brief overview, essentially front-end frameworks like React or Angular, maybe you've heard of them or worked with them before. Essentially, why do they use state and why is dependency so important? And it's because if we didn't track state and the dependencies between them, then essentially any time a piece of software updated in your app, you clicked a button or sent a request or whatever it may be, we would need to re-render the whole page in order to ensure all the right bits of information updated in your user interface. And so that unsurprisingly, that's deeply inefficient. And so like those frameworks here, that's exactly what we're doing in Retool. We're analyzing, for each piece of state, what is it dependent on? And if you see here at the bottom, if we search for all requests with software names, or if we're searching for this transformer, we can actually see what it's updating and what it depends on. Now that's really powerful and really useful. I imagine if you have ever played around with any of these front-end frameworks like React, there will be a time where dependency loops happen, or you haven't quite configured state correctly using useState, and it causes all sorts of issues. Whereas here we have a visual representation to actually understand, okay, so what is it updating and what does it depend on? And then this is then really powerful to then move up and down that chain to be able to find the root cause of different bugs. So if we were to go down the chain in this example, so clicking through on the component, the table that should be displaying this data, unsurprisingly, it's not showing any data because it's relying on this transformer. So if we go back up the chain, we can see the transformer here, and it's null. Unsurprisingly, we just discussed that it currently has an issue returning any data, so nothing here. But now if we go back up the chain, just like we figured out before, we can see get all requests query, and unsurprisingly, we do have a request here. This is the one that is working. Again, if we go back, we can now go check get software providers. I know we've already figured this one out, but unsurprisingly, yes, this is showing as having the error. So I'm going to give a little pause there. So just give a recap. So far, we've discussed how to understand app context with assist and the debugging tools. And then we've discussed two of the main methods to find the root cause of issues. One by using the kind of inbuilt ability to hover over variables within Retool to understand its state, but also the concept of this state tab in Retool and the ability to move up and down the dependency chain. So with that said, we want to now open get software providers, as we have quite extensively covered that this is most likely the root cause of the issue. And we're now going to get into resource query debugging. So with any kind of query in the code editor, you can both either test or run the query. The main difference being test, you're just running it within the context of this output, output pane within this query. Whereas run, you're running it in the context of the app. So you're updating the state in the context of the application. So for now, we're just going to run test to not change anything. And we can get a clearer breakdown of the error here. Invalid credentials error, unable to authenticate, double check your API key and try again. Now, this is a classic authentication error. Again, probably one of the most common kind of resource errors you're going to come across. So we're going to walk through, what are the main scenarios here and how can you go about debugging this? So typically with authentication errors, there's only a limited number of options that could be causing this. So either we aren't sending the API key, we're sending it, but it has the wrong credentials, or we're sending it in the wrong format for this server to be able to interpret it. So let's work our way through kind of understanding which of those three is it likely to be before we go into depth of actually researching the solution in more detail. So in the output pane, we can switch across to API request. And this gives us a nice little breakdown of both what we're sending, so the request, so what we're sending to the resource, and the response of what are we getting back. And if I go to the request property here, I can view, okay, we are sending an API key, and it's nicely sanitized by Retool. So we do seem to be sending something here. So next, I'm now going to check, okay, it does seem to be the correct API key. And like I was showing before, the ability to hover over variables, we can hover over this one and we can view, okay, yeah, we are sending an API key here. Just as a disclaimer, it's generally not best practice to store an API key kind of in the header within the resource query in an app. It's better, unsurprisingly, to have it within the resource itself. But for demonstration purposes here, I've set this up kind of within the query. So we've ticked off those first two. So chances are it's actually something in how we have configured the header. So we're going to go about asking assist to see whether it can help us with this. So with opening up the assist panel on the side, we have the ability to reference things within the app. So if I type @ I can then search for get software providers. So I am selecting this specific query, and let's ask and see if Assist can help me. How should I be setting up the resource API key here? So great place to start is asking Assist or AI in general. How should I be configuring these resources? How do they work? I'm getting this error back. Typically, what does it mean? And while Assist is working on a little response there, and it seems to actually have given it, and we'll see if it can. So it seems to be struggling here to understand what's going on. So it's saying how to set up the API key. You have two options: create and configure. So I don't think it's quite getting to the root cause here. So the other option is if AI maybe isn't quite giving you the solution, the other option is actually to go the old school way, which is finding some documentation. So let's search for Postman mock server API key. And let's try and research, okay, how should things be configured here? I'm not going to read through the docs with you on this call, but let's have a quick run through, and we can see when creating a mock server from an API call. And if we were to give a quick skim down here, we can see, okay, to the request X API key header. So actually, it seems to be we're probably sending the header in the wrong format. So if we go back, yeah, we're sending API key, not X API key. Let's change it to X API key. Hopefully give that a test. Amazing. That's now returning a list of software. So let's now click save and run. Wonderful. That is working and sending the right request. Amazing. So to give a brief recap, we've understood the app context. We have gone into root cause analysis, and then we have looked at using both Assist and also manually looking at the documentation to try and understand how a resource should be configured. And we've changed the resource header here to X API key, which is the header that this Postman server is looking for. And so now we're getting the appropriate list of software providers. I assume here that for this demo, for this MVP that Jerry's made, we're just currently using example list of software. Nice. I'm going to take a quick pause there, have a little drink, and then let's go on to the next section. So now we've made this change, we've made this fix. Let's see if there's more errors for us to get stuck into. So you can either reset the app state from the top right here, so you can click on the ellipses on at the top right of the editor and click reset app state, or you can just refresh the page, and this will just reset the state to see, okay, let's see if we're still getting any issues. And just like we did before, let's go straight to the debug tools to see if we have any problems. And looks like we've still got some errors that are going on here. So just like we did before, let's start with these and work our way backwards of what could be causing this. So again, like I did before, you can open up this specific root of this bug by clicking onto the item here, and that will then open the transformer, and it seems to be the same transformer we were looking at before, so the one that was taking the requests, getting the software, and adding the software name to the requests. And now let's get into the wonderful world of debugging in JavaScript. So it's a lifelong journey, understanding JavaScript errors and getting better at debugging with it. I wanted to highlight one of the main tools that you would use to debug in JavaScript, and then kind of talk through kind of some more areas from that. So like we did before, let's do a slow work through of looking at the error in more detail. So error, cannot read properties of undefined, reading to uppercase. And like we did before, let's open up this error and we can view which line it's happening on. So this is line 8. Let's go to line 8 in the transformer, and we can see again here that to uppercase issue. So similar to that find.software issue, the same thing here means we're trying to read to uppercase on full name, but full name probably most likely is undefined or doesn't exist here. So let's now try and work our way back from there. So looking at the code here, we can see that there's a match made on software. So chances are here it's an issue with whether full name exists as a property on software. So what we're going to use here is something called console logs. So effectively, unsurprisingly, they're ways to be able to print information into the console that you have on the side here in your debug tools. And they're one of the main ways to understand the information that's on what's going on within your logic. So you can do that by typing console.log, and then you just type the specific variable that you're looking to print. And typically, I always like to also include a string, a comma, and then a string to then also print, what am I actually showing here? It can sometimes be hard if you have lots of console logs to understand what's printing what. I'm going to do this for software, and also while I'm here, it can also just be useful to get as much information as we can. So I'm going to also do requests so we can see both of them. And then we have the ability to run a test. And then as you can see here, it should then print out in your console the information. You'll need to make sure that you have both the errors, well, importantly, the info messages enabled so you can view console logs. And you can see every time this piece of code runs, it's going to keep printing out this information for me. And then I can use this to understand, okay, let's first look at requests, and I can see requests is coming through and nothing unusual there. But if I open up software, and let's say we see we've got an array of objects here, and if I open up the objects, I can see the structure of the software, and we seem to have an ID, a name, and a notes. So actually having a look here, we are defining the name as a property rather than full name here. So actually, I think this should be name rather than full name. So I'm going to change that. And like we did before, I'm going to run a test. We now have a software request with the software name here. Amazing. And if I run save, let's double check that. Perfect. So that's now saved and working. We've got an access request with a software name. So that's working as expected. So you may be thinking, that's great, Ollie. I've used console logs, but that was quite a lot of effort. And you just showed me earlier around how you can hover over any variable in Retool and understand straight away what's going on. So I could have just gone there. Let's have a look at what the match is made up of. We've got ID, name, and notes. Okay, come on, that's name straight away, very quick fix. Why have you showed us console log here? And I think the main reason is for more complex applications and more complex pieces of code, console.logs is always the fallback to go to understand the makeup of what's going on here. Typically, when you find AI is incredibly efficient at writing good bits of code. So if I was to give this to an AI and say, write me a more efficient solution, it probably will come up with a better way of writing this piece of code. But will it always have the appropriate context of the data structured and how it's being passed around, et cetera, et cetera? No. And so console.logs is a really good solution or way, something to have in your toolbox to fall back on to kind of really understand what's going on in the code here. But then following that, you may say, okay, that's great, Ollie. I can, use console logs, but what about if the AI does understand context? Unsurprisingly here, we could go to assist, and just like we did with the resource, we could probably at this specific transformer, like we did with the resource, and say, fix this piece of code for me, and it will most likely give a good effort at providing a solution. And I think again, we run into that same issue that potentially for simpler issues, that would work. But as soon as you get to a point where there's it's more specific context that you haven't passed on or takes a lot of effort to pass on, suddenly you can be lost at sea with what's going on in your code. And so having the idea of being able to use console.logs is a great place and a great skill to have. So let's just, for aesthetic reasons, get rid of those console logs. Now we know it's working. So I'm going to delete those and save that again. So that will then stop printing out on the console. And just like we did before, let's refresh the page to double check whether if there are any more issues. And we now seem to have no more problems in the console. So maybe we're nearly there. Just to give a brief pause and recap, we have now discussed app context, debugging, finding the root cause of issues, debugging resource queries, and also debugging JavaScript. We're going to now finally get into the last section, which is, let's see if we can actually submit an access request. So I'm going to click request. I'm going to click through on a piece of software. So I'm going to select one randomly. I want to be an admin test, and I'm going to write just a test justification. And let's see if we can submit this workflow. Okay, unfortunately, we're still getting a problem here. It does seem to be creating the access request, but the workflow that seems to be triggered to send an approval doesn't seem to be working. So just like we did before, let's start with the debug tools. Let's start going to the error. Let's start by clicking onto the resource query that's triggering this. And like we did before, let's run a test to double check what the error is. Okay, yeah, we're getting that problem through. So with this scenario here, it's only I have access to the workflow. We're not going to run through the same process of duplicating duplicating the JSON and et cetera, So you can just watch along if you have been following up until now. And so reading through this error, we've got this error true message, no recipients defined. We also get the workflow run ID. So clearly there's something wrong potentially with how we've set up this workflow. So we can open this workflow from this app and get started into debugging workflows. So just like we did before, we're going to take a moment to understand what's going on here. We have a start trigger that seems to take in a request ID and an email. We then get the details of that specific request. We then, if we do get the details of the request, we then are looking to send an email to notify the admin to say you've got an approval that you need to make. And so that seems to be kind of what we're trying to achieve here. So just like with the app, with the debugging tools there, we have the run history or run logs, where we should then be able to go into more detail around what caused the problem here. And what we can do is we can filter the runs, and I just want to try and find the specific run that I'm looking at here. And by clicking onto that, the one that I want to investigate, we'll get a full history of the what happened. So the global, all the blocks. So the blocks are the individual bits of code here. So the start trigger, the get requests, even the branch, etc. And you'll see here we get a full breakdown of what was triggered, whether it was successful, etc., etc. And actually, we can see the email admin block is the one that's highlighted in red. So this is the issue. And if you go to data or JSON, we can see a clearer breakdown of this problem. So error true, no recipients defined. If we go to the block, we can see here, chances are we're not appropriately configuring the email to send the email to send this to. So a really, really useful tool within workflows is to go to inputs. And within here, you'll see basically all the information that this block takes in. And in opening that, you get lots of insight into what you're trying to use to get that data and then what it evaluated as. So we can see here for this, who we're sending the email to. We've got start trigger.data.email. So we're pulling from the start trigger and we're just getting my full name, not my email. Which isn't great. And if we double check that, so we can see what's happening here with the body, we can see we've got the raw expression with the get request details.data and my name. So that seems to be kind of working as expected. So let's double check where we're pulling this from, which is the start trigger. So we can click onto the start trigger. And again, for this specific workflow run, we can view what did this start trigger output, what was its data. And viewing this here, we can see next to email, again, seem to have sent my name in this trigger rather than my email. So actually it looks like the error lies with the app, not with the workflow. So if we go back to the app, we can now have a look at this in more detail, and we can see here it seems to be that we're sending my full name, and just like we were doing before, you can hover over to see the current state, and we can see, yeah, I'm sending Ollie Clyde there as my full name, not email, but I do have access to send my email here, so let's change that, and let's run the test again. True, amazing. So that's now working. And hopefully if you have followed along, you should have been able to add your email to current user and should have received an email. So just like we did before, let's refresh and finally, let's see if Jerry has made any more problems. So I can see here, I've now got my pending request at the bottom. Let's try and approve that. So if I click on to that pending request, I can now determine whether to reject it or approve it. Let's give myself access. Let's approve it. Brilliant, amazing. And let's now turn to approved. So it looks like everything's working as expected. Amazing. Thanks so much for following along. I hope you found that kind of useful and covered some areas that either you haven't seen before or some new tips or tricks that you can now use when working in Retool yourself. To give a little recap of some of the main points I wanted to get across. One, the importance of starting broad and then going deep, effectively using things like assist to understand the bigger picture of how the app works, and then going from the debugging tools to the error to then kind of work your way back to the specific issues, or like we found with the resource query, what are the most likely issues here, and then work our way ticking them off before going into the deep depth of reading documentation. The importance of testing incrementally. Everything we went through today would make one change and then test. And so not trying to fix everything at once, but iterating is really useful and important when debugging. Understanding dependencies, checking dependencies, using the state tab, understanding state, I think is a really important part of debugging. And so something to be familiar with. And finally, the importance of reading documentation. I don't know if I mentioned this already, but when I was first started to get into software development, biggest piece of advice I'd got was always read the docs. Obviously, that's changing now with how good AI is at summarizing things for you. But effectively, the amount of times I've gone to set up a resource, skim the docs, thought I understood what's going on, and then ended up having a really common error that I could have avoided earlier on. Lovely. So thanks so much for following along and listening. Looking at the time, we do have some extra bit at the end to talk through any questions that you may have. I don't know, Mar, if there are any in particular that cropped up that we can get into straight away.
I think Mike had one question about the header in the resource configuration, so maybe you could show that on the screen.
Yes. So if I go back to that resource query and the header that I have set up here, Let me see if I can get the specifics of the question. So yeah, any questions around the header? The solution was to add in the X API key, which
Yeah. And
um,
if you could show the if you edit the resource configuration, how you can place it there as well. So where
oh
it should be for best
yes,
practice.
yeah. So for best practice, by editing the resource, it just means that anytime this resource is used within any app, it will then by default have that API key. And so we could do the same here, X API key here, and then set it just like we did before. The only difference being actually it's defined as an environment variable here. So we can see that Postman API key rather than within the app itself, which is stored in the Retool context. Just explain that in detail. There's a slight difference there. It's set as an environment variable rather than within the Retool context. So effectively what this means is you as an admin can set it up of here are the details of how you can connect to this resource. And then you can then they can use that without knowing the API key or it being exposed within the app itself. But they can then still access the data or maybe create their own requests to this endpoint.
We had one question from Ollie, which is how do you know which queries run on page load?
Great question. Um, so on timeline here, so that was in the debugging tools, the timeline tab. Effectively, if you refresh the page and go to the timeline tab, this will show you basically all of the ones that run kind of on page load. And typically, it's also ones most likely. If you go to any resource query here, you should be able to view if we were to say get or request query. Um, you can look at the run behavior as well. And you'll be able to see, okay, this run behavior is that it's going to kind of run on page load. And so it's automatic rather than something that's done manually. So you're manually triggering it, through an event handler, whether within a button or whatever it may be. But yeah, technically speaking, these are all on that refresh on that page load. And yeah, out of curiosity as well, you can sort of see some information around the timeline of that load. Yeah, as I mentioned, you can use this to go into more detail around what could be causing uh, performance issues within your application. Nice. Within the instructions, I've also included some useful resources. Effectively, they're just a rundown of the debugging tools in the app, the run history setup and workflows, as well as kind of common resource connection errors that we see. So they're very useful to have a read yourself and kind of use when debugging in Retool.
I think that's it for questions.
Nice. Brilliant. So to finish for the next event that we're running, we're running a Retool Summit in the Shard, March 26th. Don't know, Mar, if there are any more specifics on this, but if anyone wants to scan the QR code, they can get some more details around how they can register, find out what's going on. And it would be brilliant to see you there. Can see a question on. Okay, brilliant. Well, to wrap up there, thanks so much for joining. And yeah, hopefully see you at Retool Summit. Thanks so much.